Chapter 10. Frank Falcone had 100 grand on that fight at the Cleveland Armory. He was going to be ringside. He told Nick Garachi, even if it meant Garachi swimming the shore with Falcone lashed to his back. Don Forlenza offered the services of one of his boats. Laughing Sal Narducci pointed out that the bigger ones were already at the fight. There was nothing left but fishing boats unfit to go that far in open water during a storm. It was not a long flight, maybe 15 minutes. Garachi told them not to worry. He'd flown in conditions 100 times worse than this, which of course he had not, and he went to ready the plane. He radioed the tower at Burke Lakefront Airport, which issued a staunch warning not to take off. He pretended not to hear. The twin-engine airplane carrying Tony Molinari, Frank Falcone, Richard the Ape Aspromonte, Lefty Mancuso, and their pilot, officially listed as Geraldo Maley, lifted off from Rattlesnake Island and into the dark sky. From the moment they were airborne, the flight was a struggle. He was so preoccupied with the challenges the storm threw his way that he wasn't at all sure if there was anything wrong with the fuel. Probably there wasn't. He had checked both tanks before takeoff. He switched to the other tank not so much as a precaution, but because he needed to focus on other things. As he strained through the soupy sky to see the lights of Cleveland, he thought he heard the engine sputtering, and without thinking he switched the tanks again and blurted something to the tower about sabotage, which, under these conditions, would have been difficult to assess for a pilot 10 times more experienced than Nick Garachi. The plane made its hapless approach toward Cleveland. The pilot's last words to the tower were "Sono futotto," translation, "I'm fucked." Then, a mile from shore, the plane plowed into the frothy brown chop of Lake Erie. Garachi had been hit hard playing football in school, much harder in the rink. Once, at Lake Havasu, he'd been in a speedboat driven by his father and slammed into an aluminum dock. The hardest tackle, the most brutal punch, and that speedboat crash he'd somehow survived combined would have felt about half as bad as smacking into Lake Erie in an airplane. The plane flipped. What felt like a moment later, Garachi was underwater. His door was jammed. He worked his legs free and started stomping a bigger hole in the glass of the windshield. The water was completely black. As he tried to get through the hole, a hand grabbed his arm. It was too dark to know whose hand it was. He tried to pull the man with him, through the hole in the windshield, to safety. The man was stuck. If Garachi hung on, they'd both die. He was about out of breath. The grip was strong, digging deep into the flesh of his arm. Garachi pried off the fingers, feeling and hearing the bones actually break. Garachi swam free of the sinking wreck. He used the sound of the pounding rain to find the surface. His lungs spasmed and his Adam's apple bucked. A tingling feeling shot down his arms. He felt a twinge, almost a draining feeling, at the top of his skull. He would never make it to the top. He was going to breathe water. This was it. Have a good last thought, something worthy. But all he could think of was this filthy water, near home, and how this was where he was going to die. He kept swimming. His mother had loved to swim. His mother, that was a good last thought. He loved her. She was a good mother, a good woman. He could see her. She was younger than when he had last seen her. Now she was sipping a martini and reading a movie magazine beside the public pool in his old neighborhood. She was dead too. Johnny Fontaine, along with his very special guest, Buzz Fratello, and the lovely and talented Miss Dottie Ames, finished their Bofo show at the beautiful Oasis Room at the Castle in the Sand, with a lengthy and hilarious medley of songs about booze, performed for a crowd that didn't yet know a thing about the crash. It was a crowd invitation only, largely made up of Teamsters officials from all over America, along with their wives, or more beautiful simulacra. Michael Corleone had also, as an olive branch, invited a few select others, food, lodging, and $1,000 worth of chips, all on the house. Because it was a private party, even those who were ordinarily unable to set foot in Las Vegas were able to attend. For example, right by the stage was Don Molinari's brother Bucci, who had done time for hijacking and extortion, and several other top men from San Francisco. In the men's room, trying to urinate and cursing inventively at his prick in Italian, was Carlo Tramonti, manslaughter, grand theft, arson, insurance fraud, the boss of New Orleans and a rising power in Havana. There was at least one member representing each of the other New York families, each accompanied by women and bodyguards. The pale man in the gigantic sunglasses in the booth all the way in the back was Chicago's Louis the Face Russo, possession of stolen goods, aggravated assault, bribing a federal agent, believed by some members of the FBI to be in line for the still vacant position of Capo di Tutti di Capi for the entire so-called La Cosa Nostra. Together, the appearance of all these people had provided enough cover to fly in several of the Corleone's own associates from New York without arousing suspicion. Also noteworthy, particularly since they were right by the stage and had come in from so much good-hearted innuendo-laden needling, were those blushing, happy honeymooners, the former Miss Suzanne Zalucci and her new husband, Ray Clemenza. Come on, folks, put your hands together. Let's hear it for 'em. In his own black velvet booth, Michael Corleone leaned back and took a long drag of his cigarette. He looked at his watch. It was Swiss, more than 50 years old. It had once belonged to a Marine named Vogelsong, who'd used his dying breath to say he wanted Michael to have it. By now, if everything had gone right, everyone on that plane should be dead. Michael had seen planes crash. Up close. It was all too easy for him to picture the terror on the men's faces as the plane went down. He shook his head. He didn't want to think about it. Instead, he'd think about this. His plan had worked. He'd had setbacks, collateral damage, and mid-course corrections, but in the end, all had worked. Now the commission could meet. Hagen was wrong. No agreement would last unless it involved Chicago. But no peace involving Chicago would be in the Corleone's best interest unless Louis Russo came to the table motivated. This crash should motivate him plenty. Michael had probably never smoked a whole cigarette so fast or enjoyed one more. He lit another and inhaled deeply. He had done what he needed to do, period. Because of that, he'd sleep just fine. After all this was wrapped up in a month or so, he'd take a vacation and sleep 12 hours a day. Had he ever, as an adult, taken a vacation? Those years he'd spent hiding in Sicily were a lot of things, but a vacation? No. During the war, he'd taken liberty, Hawaii, New Zealand. But a family vacation? Never. He and Kay and the kids should go to Acapulco. Maybe see Hawaii again, at peace. Why not? Clown around with Anthony and Mary, the way Pop always made time to do. Get buried in the sand. Rub oil on Kay's sexy back. Maybe see if he could get her pregnant again. He'd wear flowery shirts and dance the mambo. Michael lifted his half-full water glass. We did it, Pop, he thought. We won. God almighty, Clemenza said, red-faced from laughter and pointing a fat thumb at Fratello, who was racing around the stage like some frantic palehead. He's something, eh? Something, Michael said. Fontaine had held back, doing quiet numbers and joking around in the ones that would have made him push his voice. But the brilliance when he exuded when he wasn't trying, maybe especially then, was a thing of beauty. He was a punk, but he was an artist too. Michael couldn't be talked to the way Fontaine had this afternoon, but by the same token he couldn't stay mad at the guy. Fratello? An embarrassment. He was a guy who'd knocked around for years as the cafone on the saxophone. Then he'd put down the sax, started singing like a Negro but with a Mamma Mia Italian accent, married a leggy blonde half his age, and bam! Buzz Fratello and Dottie Ames, stars of the Starbright soap Variety Hour. Fratello finished the set by sprinting across the stage, diving to the door, sliding 10 feet or so through Dottie's legs, coming to a stop perfectly timed so he could roll over, look up at her crotch, and rub his eyes in comic disbelief. Fontaine cracked up. Dottie helped Buzz up, and they all took a bow. The crowd rose to its feet. The singers left the stage. The ovation continued. The orchestra members kept the fanfare going. Clearly, there would be an encore. Michael felt a hand on his shoulder. "Phone," Hal Mitchell whispered. "It's Tom." Michael nodded and put out his cigarette. Showtime. He glanced at Louis Russo's table. Someone was whispering something in his ear, too, and when Michael made eye contact with the whisperer, the man looked away. Michael reached over and tapped Clemenza. Seconds later, as the orchestra launched into a vampy take on Malafamina, and Buzz, Dottie, and Fontaine locked arms and gamboled back on stage for their encore, some of the implications of what may or may not have happened on Lake Erie, sketchy as the details were, must have dawned on Louis Russo. But by the time he peered over his sunglasses at the black velvet booth in the corner, it was empty. Even the candle had been blown out. Nick Geraci's head broke the surface. He gasped for air, and it surged down his arms and legs, and then he screamed. It was the first time he felt the excruciating pain from his cracked ribs and broken leg. About 100 yards away, a flaming oil slick marked the spot where the plane had smashed into Lake Erie. Bobbing in the middle of it were one of the wings, a big chunk of the side of the fuselage with the painted lion logo on it, and the upper half of what turned out to be Frank Falcone's corpse. Geraci wasn't sure what had happened or whose fault it had been, though the pain and adrenaline made it hard to think clearly. He was tethered to reason only by his conviction that if everyone back there was dead, he might as well be. Rescue could mean death. Through the rain he could see the haze of the Cleveland skyline. He swam away from it, north, back to Rattlesnake Island, to Canada, a passing boat, some place where he could buy himself some time to work things out, some place where he'd have a shot at controlling his own fate. His leg felt like it was on fire with pain, and his cracked ribs made it almost impossible to breathe. Yet by the time the Coast Guard speedboat spotted him, Geraci was out a quarter-mile from the crash site, in extreme shock, unconscious, his lungs filled with water, going down. Concealed behind the parapets of the highest of the Castle in the Sands 3 Moorish towers and encased in the spire of mirrored glass was an unnamed, revolving ballroom where the ceremony would be held. "I bet you're smelling printer's ink right now," said Clemenza, giving Michael a gentle elbow. "You can about taste it, am I right? In the back of your throat, eh? Like oil, but worse." The reflection of Michael in the shiny brass elevator doors was sipping a crystal goblet of ice water. He looked like a put-together, invulnerable, slick-haired man of respect, with the wind at his back and the world by the balls. "I'm telling you," Clemenza said. "I don't think I ever seen your old man so—" Michael nodded. "Waterworks," Clemenza said. "Only time in all the years I ever saw him like that." Clemenza had been the one who'd brought Michael to be straightened out, a few weeks after he returned to America from his exile in Sicily. The killings of Salazzo and McCluskey, which had served to make his bones, had happened 3 years earlier. Clemenza had had tickets to a Dodgers game he'd gotten from a friend he had with the team. Second row, right behind the plate. It was the first game Michael had seen since they started letting Negroes play. He'd had no idea this had happened or when. He had spent 7 of the last 8 years away from America, fighting and killing and in constant danger of being killed. He'd missed things. He hadn't even been to his brother's funeral. The Dodgers beat Chicago 4-1. On the way home, they stopped at what, when Michael left the country, had been the offices of a daily newspaper. One of Clemenza's Shylocks had, for the usual reasons, found himself in possession of the building. Clemenza said he needed to take a look at the place to figure out whether to rent it, sell it, or torch it, all of which was true. When they entered the huge empty room where the printing press had been, there, in the pale late summer night, sitting behind a long table, its blue paint peeling, were Tessio and Michael's father. On the table were a tapered candle, a holy card, a pistol, and a knife. Michael knew what was coming. They were initiating him into the family. After all that had happened, this was just a formality. It had been Michael's own idea to kill those men, the man who'd arranged the hit on Vito Corleone and the crooked cop who, when he came to the hospital to finish the job, had to settle for smashing Michael's face. It had been his brother Sonny's job, as acting Don, to okay those killings. Tessio had objected, saying it would be like bringing a guy up from the minors to pitch in the World Series. Later, Vito claimed he'd never wanted this life for Michael, but it had always been obvious he thought no one else could ever be good enough. At Michael's initiation, his father mumbled a few unintelligible words before his shoulders started heaving. He began to sob. Clemenza followed suit. Tessio finished the job, in a combination of Sicilian and English, with saturnine eloquence. Afterward, they killed 2 bottles of Chianti. Vito couldn't stop weeping. The smell of ink and grease registered on Michael, but somehow not the intensity of it. The next day, his clothes stank so badly they had to go in the trash. A week later, the building burned to the ground. Lightning, ruled the fire marshal. A month after that, the guy quit the fire department and moved to Florida. Now he fronted money laundering operations down there, liquor stores, vending machines, real estate, and was engaged to Sonny's widow, Sandra. The elevator doors opened. Michael and Pete boarded it and rode it together to the top. For Lenza'd never clip his own godson, Clemenza, who, on Michael's orders, had killed Carlo Rizzi, the father of Michael's godson, sucked 3 olives off his toothpick and kept the pick in the corner of his mouth. I also don't think it's possible a guy from another outfit could set foot on that fucking island without the Jew knowing about it, Clemenza said. I say accident. The best information Hagen had been able to get was that there had been one survivor. This had not been confirmed. If the survivor was one of the 2 Dons or one of their men, it would look better. If it was Gracchi, what would happen next was hard to figure. It might or might not be possible to pass him off as some private pilot named O'Malley with no connection to the Corleone family. Also, it was going to be nearly impossible to learn what he knew or had been able to figure out. And then there was the matter of the thunderstorm. The storm might take the blame for everything, which would keep the crash from having its full effect. But Michael was already plotting how he might use any uncertainty over the cause of the crash to his advantage. Accidents don't happen, Michael said, to people who take accidents as a personal insult. So sabotage? I don't know. I agree, Don Forlenza wouldn't kill his own godson, even if he had a reason to. As far as we know, he didn't have a reason. But I'm not so sure it's impossible to sneak onto that island somehow. If not for Lenza, Michael shrugged and arched his eyebrow and kept his eyes fixed on Pete's. La testa di cazzo! Clemenza pulled out the elevator's emergency stop knob with one hand, pounding the wall with the other. Russo! Michael nodded, as if in thought. One airplane, he said. And who gets hurt? They hit us. They hit Molinari. They hit their own guy, Falcone, a reckless man who maybe they thought had stepped too far out of his own. And it all looks like Forlenza ordered it. Their 4 biggest competitors not just here, in Las Vegas, but in the western half of the country. Everything west of Chicago is Chicago, Clemenza said, mocking. Quello stronzo. If you're right, Michael said, turd only scratches the surface of what that guy is. He shook his head in a way he was sure looked sincerely rueful. Clemenza filled his fat cheeks with air, exhaled slowly, then pushed the button in. When the elevator doors opened, a few dozen people were already there, scattered throughout the ballroom. Clemenza patted Michael on the back. Don't let that shit ruin this thing here, he whispered. Enjoy it, okay? You went to all that trouble to have your face fixed where that cop fucked it up. Show it off a little. Smile. Michael had lied. Not lied exactly. More like he'd led a horse to water. and Pete Clemenza had bent over and drunk. If Pete blamed Russo that fast, he wouldn't be alone. The truth was that Michael Corleone had sought to hurt all four of his biggest rivals in the West. That was the easy part. The hard part had been to do it without taking the blame. By orchestrating the incident so that not another living soul knew all of what he'd done. Not Hagen, not Pete, nobody. He might have done that too. Frank Falcone was a menace. Ever since Michael had had Mo Green killed, Falcone had been the biggest roadblock to the Corleones' expansion into Las Vegas. Pignatelli would be more obedient to Chicago than Falcone was, yet because of his business relationship with the Corleones, both his involvement in the Castle in the Clouds and the satchel of cash he'd had Johnny Fontaine deliver as a tribute for killing Falcone, he posed no threat. Tony Molinari was a long-time ally, true, but his increasing wariness about Michael setting up a base of operations in Lake Tahoe, a couple 100 miles from San Francisco, was a problem destined to escalate. Unfortunately, he'd become a cancer best removed now. Forlenza was an old man. Disgracing him while he was still alive was better than killing him. He'd been bragging to the other Dons for years about his little island fortress. He'd get all or part of the blame for the crash. Even if no one came after for revenge, there would be pressure from his own men for him to step down. Sal Narducci, who'd struck a deal with Michael Corleone and overseen the sabotage of the plane, would become Don. After waiting for the job for 20 years, he was a good bet to keep his mouth shut about how he finally got it. Installing Narducci as Don would also sever Cleveland's ties to the Barzinis. The best part of the plan was what it would do to Chicago. It would be impossible to prove that Russo had been behind it, and equally impossible to disprove it. But once Michael let the members of the commission know that the dead pilot O'Malley had really been his new capo, all the right people would consider who'd had the most to gain. Would Forlenza kill his own godson? No. Would Michael Corleone kill his new hotshot capo? Who could imagine? That left Chicago. Michael had managed to hit Chicago without killing a single one of Russo's men. Michael would thus not have to worry about Russo seeking revenge. The only tangible loss Russo would suffer was that now he'd come to the peace table dealing from a position of weakness. But that was all Michael needed. The most difficult decision Michael had made was to kill Garacci. Without question, Garacci had done a brilliant job with the drug business, but his aggressiveness was an issue. His ambition was boundless, larger than even he himself understood. Though he'd been unswervingly loyal, his connection to Forlenza would always be a concern. He'd always be sore about Tessio, and when Michael had made Fredo Soto capo, Garacci had asked him, in public, if he'd lost his mind. They'd been at dinner at Patsy's. No one else had been at the table. No one else had heard. Garacci had apologized, but few Dons would tolerate such disrespect. It might have seemed petty, but it convinced Michael Corleone that all the smaller concerns about him were well-founded and destined to grow more severe. Still, only the last justified having Garacci killed. Even that might have been forgiven. There had been no betrayal. Garacci's assets easily outweighed his liabilities. Michael liked him. Sacrificing Fausto Garacci Jr. was not what Vito Corleone would have done. It was, rather, the act of a Marine who'd seen at least 1,000 good men die, seemingly at random. A necessary evil swapped for the chance to achieve a greater good. It was a perfect plan, unless it was true that one of the men had survived. Clemenza had lied too. Michael's initiation was not the only time he'd seen the Don like that. Still frail from his own gunshot wounds, Vito had returned home from burying Santino so racked with grief it haunted everyone who'd seen it. Michael hadn't seen it. The people who had, Michael's mother, his sister and her husband, his brothers, Tom and Fredo, and Pete Clemenza, who, soon after the sobbing started, embraced his friend and went home, leaving the family to themselves, carried with them the image of that broken man and the sounds of his horrible wails. They had never spoken of it, not to one another, and certainly not to anyone who hadn't been there, not even Michael. Several people who'd been at the Fontaine show made an appearance in the rotating ballroom. A reception, that's all it seemed to be. There was no discernible mass exodus of the union officials, orchestra members, or women. As far as any of the 13 new men might have been able to tell, one moment those other people were there. The next, maid members of the Corleone family were carrying 2 long tables, already covered with white linen tablecloths, to the center of the parquet dance floor, and every single one of the outsiders was gone. Someone hit the lights. Throughout the room, men put hands on the shoulders of the inductees and in hoarse whispers congratulated them. There would have been 14 if Fredo hadn't made Figaro miss his plane. These were men the new guys had looked up to for years, running their neighborhoods, dressed in tailored suits and holding forth in barber shops and at lunch counters and on empty peach crates in front of certain garages, driving fancy cars and fucking fancier women, dispensing favors and looking out for their own, running a court of last resort for a maligned people who needed one, operating in a world that, back then, had seemed mysterious, powerful, and unattainable. Outside the dark ballroom, oblivious tourists swam in the rooftop pool. When the ballroom lights came back up, the table was set, 13 place settings, each with a votive candle, a holy card, a dagger, and, in a gesture meant to denote the family's expansion into the Wild West, Fredo's idea, in other words, a gleaming, unloaded Colt 45. The 13 new men were shown to their places. The others, 52 of them who were able to make it, some who'd been at the show, some who'd slipped into town and into the castle in the sand just for this, sat in the chairs around the circle. Michael Corleone sat with the rest of his men. He milked the silence. He was not a superstitious man, but he worked with superstitious men, and he knew that they were counting and recounting the number of men in the middle, and not liking it that the number kept being 13. But the risk of letting them dwell on that pointless coincidence seemed worth the reward of letting the men at the table stew in their barely concealed anxiety. To a person, they were transparently trying, and failing, to look as if this were just another moment in their lives. They knew who he was and that he was in charge of this, and so it was comical to watch them try not to look at him. He could hear the voice of Sergeant Bradshaw, his old D.I. Your fool denies fear. A Marine is unafraid to admit fear. Your fool scoffs at danger. Your fool ignores danger. In the face of danger, a Marine ignores nothing. At last, Michael stood. Let me tell you a story of a boy, he said, approaching the tables. He was born 1,140 years ago in the Sicilian countryside, near the town of Corleone. His childhood was one of wealth and happiness, until, at the age of 12, the Arab hordes, on their way north through the mountains, slaughtered the boy's parents. The boy, hiding in a clay pot, peeked out and saw the blade of a scimitar decapitate his mother, and from the dead lips of her severed head she shouted words of love to her only son. These murders were acts of savagery. The Arabs were protecting nothing, avenging nothing. They did not so much as pick a tomato from the vine, a grape from the field, or an olive from the grove. They killed for the sake of killing and proceeded north toward their objective, Palermo. Michael took a cigar from the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. More than one of the men at the tables rubbed their damp palms against the sides of their thighs. The boy's name, said Michael, was Leo Lucas. Michael paused to light the cigar and let the importance of the name sink in. Though only 12 years old, he managed not only to run his family's estate, but also to work the land as long and as hard as someone twice his age. But as the years passed, he heard, in the solitude of the fields, a summons to his one true destiny. He sold his assets, gave his money to the poor, and became a monk. After many years, he returned to the village of his youth. where he performed countless selfless acts and was beloved by all who knew him. He died peacefully in his bed at the age of 100. "Cent'anni!" shouted Clemenza. Every man who had a drink knocked it back. 500 years later, Michael said, circling the men at the tables, the intercession of Leo Lucas protected the town of Corleone from an outbreak of the Black Plague. And in 1860, more than 1,000 years after his death, Leo Lucas avenged the murders of his parents by appearing as a tower of white flame before the occupying army of the Bourbon French, spooking them from Corleone and into the hands of Garibaldi, who drove them from Sicily altogether. These miracles, and many others at the site of his tomb, were affirmed by the Holy Father in Rome. Leo Lucas is now and forever. Michael took a regal puff of his cigar, strode to one of the tables, and took the holy card from in front of Tommy Neri, who was one of the 13. He kissed the card and set it back down. "The patron saint of Corleone. Gentlemen," he made a sweeping motion with his hand. Each of the 13 kissed the pasteboard image of Saint Leo Lucas. Only a few years after the terrifying appearance of Saint Lucas in the Tower of Flame, Michael said, in a cottage adjoining the fields once owned and tilled by the sainted Leo Lucas, another boy was born. His childhood was also happy until, also at the age of 12, men came to kill his father. The murder was accomplished by 3 blasts from a lupara. His mother was stabbed, gutted like an animal. Mortally wounded, she too managed to shout words of love to her son. The boy escaped. The murderers came after him, knowing that some day he would try to kill them. Michael took another long draw off the cigar. He felt his own destiny flow through him. Was Vito Andolini. He immigrated alone to the cold shores of America, where, to keep the murderers from finding him, he changed his surname, adopting the name of his hometown. It was one of the few sentimental gestures he ever made, all having to do in some way with La Familia. And here he smacked his chest with his fist, with his beloved Figliolanza. And here he touched his chin. He worked hard, helped his friends, built an empire, and never harbored an immodest thought. One day he did indeed return to Sicily and avenge the death of his parents. Vito Corleone, who earlier this year died peacefully in his beloved garden, was my father. I, Michael Corleone, am his son, but, and he indicated the men in the outer circle, these men of honor, too, are La Familia Corleone. If you wish to be with us, we invite you to be reborn as such. Michael took his seat. Fredo had been meant to perform the next part. Despite what people like Nick Garacci thought, Michael's installation of his older brother as sottocapo had been more a means of encouragement than a job. Fredo had been given a few narrowly defined responsibilities, a small crew of reliable but mediocre men, a whorehouse in the desert, and some symbolic responsibilities, which he was discharging with his usual inconsistency. Michael was resigned to this. No matter how hard you beat a donkey, it will never become a racehorse. Clemenza planted his cane on the floor, grunted loudly, and stood. Undoubtedly, each of the 13 already understood the formalities of this arrangement, but there were conventions to observe. Clemenza began by explaining the structure of the family. Michael Corleone was the godfather, whose authority is absolute. Federico Corleone was the sottocapo. Rocco Lampone and himself, Pete Clemenza, were the capo regimes. Clemenza made no mention of the role of consigliere. This had been the case since the death of Genco Abendato, first because Hagen, who was not Sicilian, could never participate in, observe, or even be mentioned in these ceremonies. Then because during Vito's brief stint as consigliere, the books had remained closed. Clemenza made no mention of Nick Garacci at all. "Before you join us," Clemenza said, "you gotta be clear on some things." He switched to Sicilian and continued, hobbling around the perimeter of the 13. "This thing we have is not a thing of business. It is a thing of honor. If you agree to join, this thing of ours must come before the country. It must come before God. It must come before your own wife, your own mother, your own children. If you are summoned and your mother is on her deathbed, you will kiss her fevered brow and leave to do the bidding of your superiors." He stopped in front of the chair where he'd started. He leaned forward on his cane. So far it seemed he might topple over. "Do you understand? Do you agree?" The men unhesitatingly gave their assent. In return, Clemenza nodded slowly and sat. Michael again stood and, as if to compensate for Clemenza's frailty, approached the tables with great, vigorous strides. He'd had too much to eat, too much to drink, too much to do, and too little sleep. Acid rose in his throat. "There are," he said, "two laws you must obey without question. You must never betray the secrets of the society, observing the ancient tradition of omerta. The penalty for violating this law is death. You must never violate the wife or children of another member. The penalty for violating this law is death. Do you vow, with your very life, to keep these laws?" They did. The older men would have noted the absence of a third law, sworn in every initiation Vito Corleone had performed. You must never get involved in the narcotics trade. No one said anything about this, not even a murmur. "You come in alive," Michael said, "and you go out dead. The day I asked you to marry me, Kay, I said our businesses would be legitimate in 5 years. Michael approached Tommy Nettie. "The instruments by which you live and die are the gun." Here Michael bit down on the cigar and picked up the Colt with one hand, and the knife. He picked up the dagger with the other. He set the weapons back down in front of Tommy, crossed over each other. "Do you agree," Michael said, "that, when called upon, you will use the gun and the knife to help this family?" "Yes, Godfather." Michael took a puff on his cigar and used it to light Tommy Nettie's votive candle. Then he pointed to Tommy's right hand. Tommy extended it. Michael picked up the dagger, pricked Tommy's trigger finger, folded it into his palm, and squeezed his fist hard, carefully to apply the pressure away from the wound and thus increase the amount of blood. One by one, the other 12 men gave the same answer and submitted to the same ritual. Michael returned to the end of the table. He tapped Tommy's closed fist. Tommy opened it, then brought both hands together, the bloody right and the clean left, turned his palms up and cupped them. Michael picked up the holy card of St. Leo Lucas, lit it with the votive candle, and dropped it into Tommy Nettie's hands. "Back and forth," he whispered. Tommy juggled the flaming saint from hand to hand. "If you ever betray your friends," Michael said, "you will burn." He blew a small puff of cigar smoke into Tommy's unflinching face. "Like the picture of our beloved patron saint now burns your bloodied palm. Do you agree to this?" "Yes, Godfather." Michael watched the card turn fully to ash. Then, tenderly as a lover, he rubbed the ash into Tommy's palms, then kissed him, softly on each cheek. One by one, the other 12 men submitted to the same ritual and gave the same answer. "You are now qualified men," Michael finally said. "Gli uomini qualificati. Gentlemen, please introduce yourselves to your brothers." The room exploded in a cacophony of congratulations, popping champagne corks, Italian toasts and benedictions. The men in the outer circle maintained their positions to ensure that the new members did in fact dutifully go around the room introducing themselves, kissing the cheeks of every man in the outer circle, missing no one. Michael had already kissed them. He ducked out the back door and down the stairs. He knew that what might greet him at home was news of the escalation of his troubles. But there was a chance his day was over. There was a chance he could get some rest and fight his fights with a clear head tomorrow. Already he felt better, getting out of that room, away from the smoke and the liquor fumes. The only kisses he wanted were from his wife, his son, and his daughter. "You go out dead." He made it to the car. while he waited for Al Neri to collect the empty pistols and catch up to him. Michael felt his stomach lurk. It all came up, the strega, the whiskey, the food Enzo had prepared so lovingly, everything from the picnic, and what looked like every last kernel of the movie popcorn. "You okay, boss?" The pistols clanked against one another in the pillowcase Neri was using to carry them, like Jacob Marley's chains in the production of A Christmas Carol Michael had been in as a kid. Natty was the chief of security here, but humping down 15 flights of stairs and through various lobbies and hallways was a pillowcase full of 13 pistols? Christ! "Oh, yeah," Michael said. He was drenched in sweat. He managed, however unsteadily, to stand up. He ripped the knee of his tux pants. "I'm perfect. Let's go." The daggers that had been used to cut the men's trigger fingers were theirs to keep. They were dazzling, jewel-handled things that had cost the family nothing. Nick Geraci had a guy.